Hello, and welcome to our next nap. My name is Irina Orishkova, and I am your nonprofit auditor. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points. I design NAPs to help nonprofit organizations and nonprofit community to better understand accounting, auditing, and financial issues. NAPs are not designed to be authoritative literature or authoritative guidance, and I would invite you to consult your own auditor, your own financial team, if your nonprofit have any specific issues. Let's start. Today we will be discussing multi-year grants. And as a reminder, we're using accounting standards based on GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. GAAP is using accrual method of accounting. Accrual method of accounting requires revenue for grants to be recognized as soon as they are unconditionally promised. And typically nonprofits recognize grants, whether multi-year or not multi-year, when they receive some notification from the donor in writing. However, it has to be unconditional. What is condition? Condition exists if there is any barrier plus right of return of funds. What is barrier? Barrier is something that exists in writing of the grant that prohibits nonprofit to recognize revenue, meaning that some event needs to be happened in order for nonprofit to be entitled for these funds. Very common barriers will exist. The funder says, for example, we will give you $500,000 if we have sufficient funds. This if is the barrier. Until this if met, the organization is not entitled to these funds. Or funder might say, we will give you $500,000 if you will meet specific performance requirements. For example, if you will hire this art director, or if you will serve thousands participants. It needs to be measurable and defined. Then until this if gets met by nonprofit, then nonprofit is not entitled to these funds. However, sometimes it's not very clear what is barrier and not barrier. Very common descriptions in the grants when the funder requires to spend money with specific budget or submit specific reports after each period. Those typically do not create barriers. Reporting requirements are not barriers. And budgets are also not barriers. Once again, barriers should be event that either needs to be done by nonprofit or donor, or maybe even outside barriers that's gonna happen. And if they happened only after, as soon as barriers unconditionally, substantially met, after that moment, nonprofit can recognize revenue. Okay, so let's go back to the grant. We discussed barriers. So if the nonprofit receive multi-year unconditional grant, then it needs to be recognized as revenue as soon as it's unconditionally promised. It means that in that year, in the year number 1, nonprofit needs to record debit receivable, credit revenue. Now let's take an example. If nonprofit received $500,000 for 5 years, and it has a budget how a nonprofit needs to spend money. And there is no specific condition, maybe some reporting requirements. In year 1, nonprofit will receive this grant and look and see, okay, this is a grant, and we need to recognize the full amount, $500,000, as revenue and receivable. Because the grant for 5 years, it's also restricted by time, and if there's a budget, it also can be restricted by purpose. Very often it gets restricted by purpose, but it is also restricted by time. Restrictions do not get affected revenue recognition, so it will be restricted revenue, but fully recognized in year 1. So we will see $500,000 in year 1. But the work that nonprofit will need to do will happen in year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. So what happens in the subsequent years, nonprofit will not have revenue for this grant, but will have expenses. It might bring some reasonable questions by nonprofit saying, in year 1, we have this beautiful revenue in net profit, positive net assets, right? We will call it net profit. Beautiful. In year 2, because there's no revenue, but we have this chunk of expenses, we're going to have losses. In year 3, we're going to have losses. Year 4, we have losses. In year 5, we have losses. And now nonprofit does not look good. Even though we planned it, we know that we're going to get revenue in year 1, but all these losses in year 2, 3, and 4, and 5 make our nonprofit not look good. And also a lot of board members, by looking in a profit and loss or statement of activity for one particular year, will see the same picture. In the year 1, big profit, organization performance looks great. Year 2, 3, 4, 5, organization performance does not look very good on the paper. Very often my nonprofits asking me, what should we do? And the answer is, that's improper way to look in a grant. Yes, very often board member and management look in 1 year at a time, but this is not a year for this is not a period for this specific grant. This grant is for 5 years. So in order to properly see performance for this specific grant, we need to see the full 5 years. Therefore, depending whatever your accounting system your organization uses for this specific grant, you need to see P&L, profit and loss, for the period of that grant, not for one specific year, because cutting just 1 year in a time does not give you full presentation of the grant. So what typically you need to do, either run profit and loss for the period for that grant, or you can always have extract from your accounting system with a top of carry over balance on that grant from previous years. So whoever analyzes performance of that grant can see the beginning balance and then expenditures and see that there is remaining balance on the grant left. Therefore, the main point here for multi-year grant, you cannot analyze performance of the organization by looking at 1 year in a time. The performance picture will be very distorted. Like I mentioned before, 1 year will be revenue and the future years will be expenses. You need to look for the full period of the grant performance. Therefore, please explain it to your board members, develop the template, or you have extract from the QuickBooks or your other accounting system that you're using that represents more than 1 year. Alternatively, some nonprofits prefer not to receive multi-year grants, and if this is the option, you can discuss with your funder and put some condition in a grant, and therefore you will receive grant that is only for 1 year, 1 period, and your revenue and expenses will agree in 1 year. However, it's not very good. It's a risky technique to do, because typically nonprofits do not want to put conditions on their grants. They want to make sure that they entitle a full amount that donor is promising. So these were hopefully helpful tips how to recognize revenue for multi-year grants and how to educate your board members and what reports to provide to the management, operating people, and board members to make them understand remaining balance on multi-year grants. Thank you so much, and looking forward to see you for the next NAP. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for being here with me.